This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Hey everyone, it's FLAK Fire. DICE bottled lightning with Battlefield 1. It felt like a true, top-notch Battlefield title. It had sprawling maps, varied combat, and was absolutely dripping with atmosphere. 4 years after launch, there are plenty of populated servers and a dedicated player base. This has many asking the question, was Battlefield 1 killed before its time? That's a difficult question to answer, and we're going to take a deep dive into it for this video, exploring a few of the maps, weapons, and vehicles that developers could have added to the game with another year of support. Again, this video is sponsored by Skillshare. If you're like me, you need to learn something every day. It really helps me cope with all of 2020 shenanigans. Right now, I'm exploring classes in motion design and After Effects to improve the channel, and who knows, maybe tomorrow it'll be music composition. The point is, whatever you want to explore, Skillshare's got you covered with on-demand, ad-free classes that are created by real experts. They're always adding new classes, so go check them out. The first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. Premium costs less than $10 a month for an annual subscription, and you also get other perks like 15% off Adobe Creative Cloud, so go explore something today. Now, to be fair, Battlefield 1 had a good run. After a dynamite trailer, the game had a stellar release and followed it up with some of the best DLC packs a Battlefield game has ever seen. They Shall Not Pass might be my all-time favorite, and In the Name of the Tsar unexpectedly expanded the fight into the Russian Revolution. Turning Tides brought us to the shores of Gallipoli, and Apocalypse added iconic battlefields like the Somme and Passchendaele. Yet truthfully, developers only scratched the surface of World War I. There are so many directions that DICE could have taken the franchise instead of launching the ill-fated Battlefield 5 in 2018. It's important to remember that when Battlefield 1 was released, games hadn't really embraced live services, and in fact, EA is still lagging way behind other publishers in that regard. Battlefield 1 was built on an obsolete premium model, and developers hamstrung themselves by promising every piece of future DLC would be included in the premium pass, and well, that of course puts a pretty big roadblock to creating some more content. Technicalities aside, continuing Battlefield 1's expansions would, in retrospect, have benefited the franchise much more than the release of Battlefield 5. So, what could DICE have brought to the table instead of pulling the plug? For maps, Battlefield 1 took us to many places in World War I, but it's notable the African campaign is missing. A masterclass in asymmetric warfare, this tactical duel between Germany's Paul Voleto-Vobeck and Great Britain's J.C. Smuts is regarded by many as some of the most brutal fighting in the war, since soldiers had to fight the elements and disease as well as each other. Battles were often fought with antiquated, improvised, or scavenged weapons like single-shot rolling block or even percussion cap designs, and combat was mobile and infantry-focused. The jungle aesthetic would also stand in stark contrast to the fighting on other fronts already featured in the game, similar to Battlefield 5's well-received War in the Pacific content. Such an expansion would bring unique cosmetics in the form of German Schutztruppen and British colonial troops, both often forgotten by mainstream history. If DICE brought this front to Battlefield 1, I would expect a focus on close quarters, infantry-only maps, but cavalry did play an important role in this theater of war. Developers could mix things up by making the combat asymmetrical, providing a material advantage to the Entente powers. DICE took a similar approach with a previous battlefield in Battlefield Vietnam, which ironically is also still held as a fan favorite. Such an expansion could feature the Battle of Tanga or the Battle of Mahiwa. The Battle of Tanga in 1914 was fought on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro and resulted in a total rout of British forces, despite the Germans being outnumbered some 8-1. The Germans captured large amounts of supplies, which let them tie up superior British forces in the region for the rest of the war. The Battle of Mahiwa took place in 1917 and saw German forces once again outmaneuver an enemy with superior numbers and equipment. For a different flavor, DICE could tackle a branch of the American Armed Forces that was neglected in the base game and expansions. I'm of course talking about the Marines. Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry are excellent choices for a late war setting. Like Iwo Jima in World War II, Belleau Wood is one of only a handful of locations designated as hallowed ground by the Marine Corps. There's a reason for that, unfortunately. The fighting here was intense, and casualties were heavy. With the exception of the Argonne Forest map in Battlefield 1, the game doesn't really capture the essence of fighting in French forest, which was very common. Chateau Thierry, meanwhile, would provide developers with another location for some sprawling urban combat. DICE could also explore some of the more incredible stories and iconic locations of World War I through existing factions. For example, the battle for Hill 60, the Lost Battalion, the Dragon's Lair, and the Marmolada Glacier are all great options for this. The battle for Hill 60 casts the spotlight on Canadian and Australian diggers and the use of mines during the Battle of the Messines. Imagine combat beginning on the map with the destructive power of frostbite showcasing a massive mine detonation. Meanwhile, a map of the Lost Battalion would be set in the Argonne Forest with a focus on close quarters combat and the accounts of the battle. Both the Dragon's Cave and Marmolada Glacier could actually focus on underground combat. The Dragon's Lair was a fortified cave network in the Chemin des Dames and changed hands multiple times over the course of the war. It even had its own underground power plant and hospital. Similarly, fighting over the Marmolada Glacier was borderline insane because you weren't only worried about enemy bullets, you were worried about the bitter cold, rock slides, avalanches, falling to your doom, right? Take your pick here. Thousands of feet above sea level, Italians and Austro-Hungarians fought on the slopes, while the latter tunneled into the glacier itself, setting up a defensive network of caves. Historically, fighting never took place inside the glacier, but it could be a great premise for some interesting Star Wars Hoth-style gameplay. Conversely, DICE could bring players to some other forgotten fronts, like the Balkans or even out in the Far East. In the Balkans, the Vidar offensive broke the back of Bulgarian defenses in 1918 and contributed to the collapse of the Central Powers. Such an expansion would also add Serbia, a faction many wanted to see in the game from the beginning. Meanwhile, the Siege of Tsingtao in China could highlight an expansion into the Pacific. If you like any of these suggestions or you have your own, you make sure to tell me down below in the comments. So, aside from potential maps, what else could DICE have added in terms of weapons and vehicles to Battlefield 1? For weapons, DICE could continue to add more experimental weapons from the time period that saw little or no use on the front lines, but had compelling designs. Gun nuts love this sort of stuff. There's just something about using a gun in-game that you will probably never see or get your hands on in real life. Among these are the William 45 automatic submachine gun, assault phase rifle, Johnston Model D, and the Meunier A6, and a quick thanks to YouTuber Dan Minigun for some of those suggestions. The William 45 machine gun is the epitome of bizarre design, featuring a 70-round drum magazine made of more magazines. Not much is known about the gun except that reloading it would have been incredibly tedious. The assault phase rifle is a development of the venerable Lewis gun, but it's magazine-fed and also weighs less than half of the original Lewis design. The Johnston Model D utilized a unique drum magazine design, and its pistol grip actually doubled as a charging handle. Meanwhile, the Meunier A6 was a French semi-automatic rifle with a variable 5, 10, or 15-round internal magazine. Unlike the other weapons mentioned here, this one actually did see limited use in the trenches. And just as developers explored more experimental weapons, they could also check out more obsolete options, like the Mauser M1871 or the Springfield Model 1873. Both of these are black powder weapons. The German bolt-action Mauser featured an 8-round tubular magazine, similar to the Lebel, and was used in the aforementioned African campaign, while the American Springfield was a single-shot trapdoor design limited only to training. Black powder weapons, of course, create significant smoke as a detriment, but they are very powerful because they fire larger projectiles. DICE could also add some interesting gadgets. The Winchester Pugsley AT rifle and the Model 1916 37mm infantry cannon are all great choices for offensive gadgets. The Winchester Pugsley was a single-shot 50 caliber rifle designed to penetrate light armor, while the Model 1916 cannon was intended for use by infantry against fortified positions. Developers would have to balance these in the game's meta somehow, but I am 100% sure they'd find a way to make them fill specific niches. Meanwhile, defensive gadgets could include calthrops and a shield. I really think calthrops were a missed opportunity in Battlefield 1. Sure, they look medieval, but calthrops were actually used in World War I and would be a perfect counter to those pesky cavalry. They could also wound and slow infantry, making them a perfect option for setting up choke points. Handheld shields also saw use in World War I, and they have been featured in other Battlefield games. As for vehicles, DICE pretty thoroughly explored most of the vehicles of World War I, but there is, of course, room for some more. For tanks, the British Whippet featured 4 machine guns and an absolutely blazing speed of 8 miles per hour. There's also the German LK2, which featured a 37mm or 57mm gun in a fixed superstructure. After the war, a few of these made their way to Sweden, where they were given a rotating turret and armed with a machine gun similar to the LK1. So DICE would at least have some great reference material, as a couple of those I believe are actually in museums in Sweden. Developers could also finish some vehicles that I suspect were in development at some point, but wound up as cut content. A submarine model appears on the Zeebrugge and Heligoland bite maps, while a Felix-style flying boat actually makes an appearance in the Turning Tides DLC trailer, but never made it into the game. If you want to look at potential behemoths, there is of course the Italian Fiat 2000 and the British-American Tank Mark 8, both of which reached the prototype stage by the end of the war. Lastly, there is of course the German Kavagan. This massive design remained unfinished, but it does truly embody the idea of Battlefield 1's behemoth. Again, this video is not intended to be a complete canvas of all of the weapons, vehicles, locations, etc. that DICE could have explored, right? Had they decided they wanted to continue the fight that was Battlefield 1. But I think it certainly goes to show that there was quite a bit left in the tank if developers wanted to further explore that time frame. And given that DICE's interpretation of World War I is really, in many ways, an alternate history version, developers could have also explored the idea of an alternate history expansion, right? What if we asked the question of what would the world have looked like had World War I gone on a little longer? You see some elements of that in Battlefield 1 already with things like the Pedersen device. So what if DICE took more creative license and explored some of the natural evolution of weapons in the post-war era? It'd be a great exercise in creativity and would certainly produce something unique. And if you're opposed to that, it actually wouldn't be the first time DICE would have done something like that. You might recall back in Battlefield 1942, they actually created a secret Weapons of World War II DLC, and that had things like the F-85 Goblin fighter and the T-95 Super Heavy tank, and there were even jetpacks. Overall, however, I think DICE would have been much better off continuing the DLC for Battlefield 1 for another year and giving Battlefield 5 more time in the oven to, refine its approach and scope. But I'm curious to hear what you think. If there was more content for Battlefield 1, would you have kept playing it? Tell me down below in the comments. Also, if there's anything that I didn't mention here that you really wanted to see in Battlefield 1 and never got, tell me that down below as well. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. If not, a dislike, and make sure that you subscribe for future Battlefield videos. If you want to support the channel, you can always share this video on social media. That is a huge boost to me, so thank you in advance. And as always, thanks for watching.